panel with K-Sue Park and Jerome Roos. And I'll read you their formal bios here, which you can also, of course, read for yourself. K-Sue Park is the Critical Race Studies Fellow at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law for the 2017 to 2019 period. She was previously an Equal Justice Works Fellow from 2015 to 2017, during which time she investigated predatory mortgage lending schemes and practiced foreclosure and eviction defense in El Paso in the office of the Texas RioGrande Legal Aid. Her scholarship examines the creation of the American real estate system and historical connections between property law, immigration law, and American Indian law. I first saw you speak at the inaugural conference of the Abolition Collective, which has launched a new journal that's mostly based in Turtle Island, which is the Anishinaabe term for North America, focusing on questions of prison abolitionism, but also connected, as necessarily those struggles are, to questions of settler colonialism, questions of colonial legacies and the exploitation of migrant labor, and to all the different ways in which political economy and racialization and colonialism play out in the present. So your presentation there was very inspirational. And also, I think I first came across your written work in a piece we were just talking about very briefly about the way in which the American legal regimes around property displacement are tied to this very interesting story of what happened to wampum beads, the sort of what Europeans mistook for the currency of the quote-unquote northeastern woodlands. So that was a really inspirational article for me, so welcome. And Jerome Roos is a fellow in international political economy at the London School of Economics and founding editor of Roar magazine. His first book, Why Not Default? The Political Economy of Sovereign Debt, is now out from Princeton University Press. I think we met many years ago in Greece at a conference that was being organized around questions of grassroots struggles against financialization and austerity in the debt economy. And since then, we've been in quite close dialogue, both as people who are interested in and participants in various struggles, and with an eye on the sort of global state of struggle. And then also as people who are interested in this question of finance, capital, and financialization. So our paths have crossed many times, and it's wonderful to have you here as well.
Great.
So they've each prepared a few minutes of remarks, and then we'll sort of go into a dialogue, trialogue sort of thing, and then that will very naturally open up into a conversation with the whole room, and I'd really encourage everyone to contribute what they have to offer. Once again, don't feel you need to necessarily phrase your contributions as like formal questions. We are trying to generate a lot of ideas and a lot of conversation in many different parallel and conflicting tracks. Maybe we'll begin with you, K-Sue.
Sure. Thank you all for being here. It's not often that people organize a conference to talk about what I think about all the time. It's actually the first time it's ever happened, the colonial origins of finance and property practices. And so thank you for organizing Max and Clea, Jana and Paul. I'm very happy to be here. I arrived from Los Angeles last night, so I'm kind of struggling, so please forgive me. I'm not even sure what I'm saying. I thought maybe I would just take this time to tell you a little bit about what I work on in general and then about a couple of specific projects. My work is very based on in the legal system of the United States and the landmass that's now the United States. In part, this is because I'm an attorney, and so that's the law that I've studied and that I know in practice, and I've been very involved in thinking about how land transactions happen now on the ground in a very kind of granular way, partly due to my experience as a foreclosure defense attorney. It's really shocking to me, I think, when I hear people talk about contemporary finance and say things, which sometimes happens, that land is no longer very central to it. I just think that's completely remarkable because the real estate market, I think, surpassed $217 trillion a couple of years ago. The United States real estate market has surpassed $30 trillion. Land still constitutes 2/3 of global assets, and so it is literally still the cornerstone of the market. And so what I really consider that I do is to look at the origins of this system and the legal mechanisms that constitute it. So now there's a very complex world of, shadow banking and all kinds of really, really complicated ways that debts placed upon land are packaged and repackaged and traded. But I think the cornerstone of that is still a system of enclosures that allow people to put a debt on an enclosure of land in the first place. And so, when I teach a seminar called Land Dispossession and Displacement, and really what I'm invested in tracking with those students is, first of all, to understand how that land system came into being, how those enclosures were formed. There's a whole technology that goes into that, of course, the survey system, creation of the central registry, the use of titles and deeds, to then enable the use of a mortgage, the mortgage being the very critical part of that, the ability to put a loan on that piece of land, using that piece of land as security that enables you to then charge interest. At a certain point, those mortgages begin to be pooled and sold in a secondary market that grows in great proportion. So these debts have actually been being sold since the 17th century, but there isn't really a market in these kinds of loans until the end of the 19th century in the United States. In the 20th century, in the early 20th century, the government steps in and creates all of these government agencies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that really constitute a huge investment in the sale of the loan itself. So there's a transition that I take my students through where we look at a 300-year history of the technology of creating enclosures. Of course, Turtle Island is a huge landmass, so it takes a long time actually to divvy it all up, to convert everything, every inch of it, into enclosures that are spoken for in some way, whether it's by a private entity or by the government. Everything is now publicly or privately owned. Everything is accounted for, and ultimately all at the disposal of the sovereign due to eminent domain. And so it takes a really long time to convert all of that. People are still in the process of doing that at the turn of the 20th century. And once that happens, I take my students, really want them to see that transition when the primary commodity in circulation in the real estate market stops being the enclosure itself, the land, and starts to become the loan on land. And since then, we've seen this massive burgeoning of techniques to package and sell those kinds of interests. The secondary mortgage market, which has just exploded, the creation of mortgage-backed securities, again in the late 19th century, that significantly expands through the government creation of these agencies that are designed to produce those kinds of more complicated, larger commodities, and then various techniques you see going forward in the 20th century that include something that I worked on called the mortgage electronic registration system. So the creation of a system that basically, as investors were pooling and securitizing mortgages, they said, wow, it's really slowing us down that every time we transfer an interest in a mortgage, we have to go back to the county where that piece of land is and pay $20 or $30 to record that transfer, get all the signatures for every single piece of land. You can imagine this is just like a lot of work that they didn't want to have to do. So they created a shell company called MERS. I think it has about 3 or 4 employees. It holds 66% of the mortgages in the United States, and now it's a placeholder. So when you buy a house, the name that goes into the record is MERS, and then behind that shell company, these transactions have accelerated at a very dizzying pace, allowing the interest in mortgages to be transferred every few months or so. So if you're a homeowner, you'll get a letter every few months or so saying that the interest in your mortgage has been transferred, and recording of who those interests are going to is optional behind that veil. So you can imagine in the crash of 2008, when people were trying to chase track down the chain of title, a lot of it just wasn't there, and a lot of that's still being litigated. So actually, like the fundamental technology of the registry and tracking chain of title that was created to further colonization and the creation of this market in the first place is now pretty much imploded. But that's to be litigated on the individual level, and meanwhile all these mortgages still exist and are generating tremendous amounts of money for investors at a large scale, people who are investing in mortgage-backed securities in the global market. So that's kind of generally what I work on. My scholarship looks at the very early history of this system, like I said, the land system, the mortgage itself. I wrote a paper on the origins of the American mortgage, as Max was just talking about, because I was very interested in the history of the mortgage when I was practicing foreclosure defense, learning to practice foreclosure defense, and was reading as much as I could about it. And my research led me to find only articles that talked about the beginnings of the mortgage practice in America in the colonial period. All this literature remarked on what an innovation it was, how different it was from the practices in England, which had traditionally protected a family's land holdings from easy foreclosure. There were lots of loopholes that people had to jump through to alienate a land from a debtor for non-payments of debts. They were talking about what a huge innovation this was in colonial America because it opened up access to credit from European merchants. But they really began the history very late in the early 18th century with the Debt Recovery Act of, I think, 1732. And meanwhile, I was reading all of these accounts of the colonization, the settlement of the first colonies in America, and seeing all these instances of foreclosure on tribal lands dating back to 1615. So this paper really tried to fill in that early history by pointing to the erasure in the literature. There's a massive erasure of the history of colonization in America, as you probably know. And so I was really trying to point out that that omission and the consequences of that omission, and to show what we learn by looking back at those early instances of foreclosure and how the mortgage as an instrument developed, because it was rooted in practices of predatory lending. So merchants would go to America, give out lots of goods, and then claim a debt. Not that any of this was mutually understood, and then go ahead and take out a mortgage on indigenous lands and foreclose. And so this paper was just really, I think, the beginning of an exploration of that. I got about that far in it. And one of the projects I'm working now is to return to that history and to more exhaustively ask, how did we move from those very first instances of foreclosure on indigenous lands to the place where the mortgage was kind of normalized and regularized and became a very common way of transacting in land in the 17th century and the early 18th century. So how did that move into common practice? And I am, right now, I was working on it on the plane right here, trying to work out this idea, what I think of as racial rehearsal. What this practice of what this transition can really tell us about financial practices themselves, what role the process of racialization plays in the innovation of this new kind of instrument, how that fundamental racial differentiation between the English and indigenous peoples allowed for the innovation of this instrument that was so radically different from anything that had happened in England, the land practices in England, to then create a precedent for the beginning of its use on other colonists, which happened slowly in the mid-17th century. It happened slowly, and so I'm trying to really look at the differences between what it meant to foreclose on another colonist's land versus an indigenous person's land, which may seem obvious to you, but they're worth enumerating, because colonists who were losing land in America due to foreclosure, all of it was a very credit-based world, is what I'm trying to show. So colonists arrived in America already indebted to investors. And when they got there, they really had no idea what kind of commodities they would have to create in order to return on that investment. So they came, they mostly traded furs for the first several decades. And then as the beaver population basically expired in New England, they turned to land as the primary commodity. But this was all innovative and creative and in the process of happening. And again, I think a lot about the technology that was used to create this commodity in the first place, so that as land became the central commodity in circulation, it's only at that point when the beaver population is dying off and people are turning to land as a way of obtaining more credit to keep the colonial project going in America, that you see the creation of the registry and the deed system. They're not too concerned about recording title interests before that, but it's really around the 1660s that this starts to happen. And that's around the time that they start to foreclose on other colonists in ways that are not protected with the traditional protections of the English mortgage. Up to that point, people have been protected. And it's in the next few decades that they start to contemplate removing those protections permanently within the American system to foreclose on other colonists. So I'm interested both in how the foreclosure on on indigenous people is different from the foreclosure on other American colonists, but also how the foreclosure on other American colonists with this new American mortgage that's less protected is really based on the foreclosure on indigenous people. So how this instrument transforms to look more like this innovation. So how the racialization really enables the innovation of a completely new form of the mortgage, but also how it's not technically possible without the former. So how this sort of racialized predatory mortgage enables a more normalized form of the mortgage that very soon thereafter becomes actually codified in law and spread across all of the colonies, and eventually then exported across the world, really. The American system is pointed to by Hernando de Soto and others who are advocating for land titling systems elsewhere. It's this form of the mortgage that is now pretty global. How the process of racialization, is really essential to the creation of a new technique, and how this new instrument retains traces of that process of racialization that enabled a trespass onto aspects of human life and dignity and community that were not allowed by law before. And I'm interested in this process of innovating new financial techniques because I think that we see this still happening all the time. I think we still see processes of racial differentiation being used to justify new ways of intruding onto dimensions of human life, security, community, stability, new techniques that are primarily used on populations of color around the world, and then replicated, refined, and made a regular part of the everyday practice of finance. It's this kind of movement that I think is wider than just the mortgage instrument itself, that you can see happening in other arenas such as labor, different kinds of practices that become normalized but originate in their use on either colonial populations or racial minorities within countries. So that's what I'm currently working on. In studying how much time?
You're good.
Okay. I'll just talk briefly about one other project. I have this new article coming out next month. I'm interested in how the process of colonization really informs pretty much every aspect of the American legal system, but especially the creation of the property system and also of the immigration system, because the process of colonization entails not only the creation of a real estate market, of a land market, but also massive migrations, inducement of the migration of tremendous numbers of people from Europe to what is now the United States and Canada, although I'm not as good on Canadian law, and also the displacement of massive numbers of people out of their homelands. So there's both the process of removal and the process of encouraging migration in, and all of those things were legally coordinated. And so this new article I have coming out tracks a 400-year history of a technique of removal called self-deportation, which is the strategy of making people so uncomfortable that they will leave a place. So using the laws, you create all of these conditions that make life unbearable for people by targeting their ability to find housing or employment these days, to attend school, to drive a car, all of these things that basically make it impossible to live in a place so that people will leave. For me, this practice has origins in Indian removal. That was the primary mode that Indian removal was pursued through the colonial period and through the early republic as well, and then carried on. Statesmen debated using this strategy of removal or mass deportation when they talked about removing freed slaves during the antebellum period. You see the adoption in northern states of what I call self-deportation laws of the stay-out variety in the northern states. Nearly all passed laws making it impossible or prohibiting black people from migrating there after abolition. You see states and municipalities in the West passing these sorts of laws to target various different aspects of life for the Chinese during the era of Chinese exclusion. You see this play out through the entire 20th century in a whole line of cases that was judged under equal protection laws, but that essentially tried to drive out various different immigrant populations from the states. And a huge wave of these sorts of laws becoming very controversial and getting passed in the 1990s and the 2000s, starting in California with Proposition 187, but then thousands of laws getting passed in the 2000s and 2010s. And so you might remember Mitt Romney's immigration platform was self-deportation. So this has been a really long and continuous strategy for 400 years, is what I argue. And when you look at the history of immigration this way, you see that in fact subordination is the primary mode of regulating immigration, and that actual deportations constitute just a small slice of it that supplements that essential strategy. It's a strategy that doesn't allow the government much control in the end. You can make people miserable so that they'll go, but if certain people refuse to go, you just actually have to get government agents to go apprehend them and imprison them and then deport them. And so I sort of look at the different legal dynamics around that and what brought situations to a head that resulted in the mass deportations of tribes in the 1830s, what people mostly know as Indian removal, even though it was several hundreds-year-long process that involved other indirect techniques as well. The state and municipal laws during Chinese exclusion leads to the creation of the individual deportation system, ultimately by the federal government. And then once that's created, you have what I think of as self-deportation logic really working through the deportation system itself. So it's my argument that the deportation system doesn't just result in the deportations of people, which is about 400,000 people in the United States. It's doing a lot of other work. The fear of deportation is conditioning the lives of 22 million unauthorized people every day, which creates a subordinated labor force, which I think is the point. So I try to shift the focus because a lot of organizing around immigration in the United States anyway is very much focused on the deportation system itself, which is right in a way. Deportations are horrible and violent, but I'm trying to show that they're actually just a small part of a much larger system of subordination that is, in fact, the immigration, the regulation of immigration in the United States, and I think also beyond, and that there have been other interests behind the regulation of migration, always historically first taking control of lands, and now, after abolition and until now, controlling labor by creating conditions upon presence. So that's my latest project. I think I've been talking for too long.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Lots to work with there in our discussion. Thank you. Jerome, we'll go to you.
All right, let me just set a clock. But I want to talk a little bit about my work on sovereign debt and its relationship to the question that's the topic of the conversation today, the relationship between finance and empire. And my personal interest in that topic was first piqued with the breakout of the Greek debt crisis in 2010. I was in Argentina at the time because I was actually trying to learn about that country's previous debt crisis of 2001 and the very powerful social movements and social struggles that had emerged in the wake of that debt crisis. And I remember very distinctly walking home on May Day after the demonstration that sort of ended up on the Plaza de Mayo, the main square in Buenos Aires, where a lot of the protests took place around the time of the Argentine financial crisis in 2001. And walking home and walking past the corner shop that had a TV with the news on, and the news was basically just images of riots in a city that looked like, had beautiful facades and palm trees, and I thought, oh shit, in the 5 minutes between me walking away from Plaza de Mayo and walking towards my place, riots have broken out, so I have to go back and see what's going on. But first, when I approached the screen and I came closer and I started looking, and I realized, hey, this is actually not Buenos Aires, this is a different city. And when I came closer and started listening to the news report, it turned out that it was Greece. And so I kind of made a connection in my head, and I thought, hey, this is super interesting. There's actually something happening here that could emerge as a new kind of Argentine crisis in our times, let's say. Something where powerful social movements are clearly emerging, something where the power of finance clearly begins to be a force constraining the democratic accountability of national governments. And so I figured that there was an interesting topic there to look at, just to compare Argentina and Greece. And that kind of spiraled out into a much bigger, much more historical project in the end, where inevitably there was some kind of overlap with the history of finance and the history of imperialism more generally. And so what I wanted to talk about a little bit today is that sort of historical aspect of the story. And maybe in the end I can make a few comments on the Greek case, but it won't be the central focus of my talk. And maybe we can talk a bit about that in the Q&A afterwards. But what I think is, at least for me personally, a useful way to think about this history, this historical relationship between finance and empire, is to think of two distinct logics of power that come out in, for instance, the work of Giovanni Arrighi in the long 20th century and the work of David Harvey in the New Imperialism, which is kind of, on the one hand, this notion of a territorial logic of power, and on the other hand, the notion of a capitalist form of power. Now, of course, that's a bit of a simple conceptual distinction, and in reality, these two have always been intermeshed in very complex ways. But nevertheless, I think that there's been an interesting development over the centuries, and especially in recent decades, where that capitalist logic of power has increasingly taken precedence, and where that has become the most important motor, if you will, of the continued structural asymmetry between the global north and the global south. And it is that logic which ultimately allows the countries of the advanced capitalist core to continue to extract enormous amounts of value from the global south, even in the absence of direct territorial occupation that we saw in the colonial era. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. There are still very important direct territorial occupations that take place. But in the field that I'm looking at, international debt, there's been an interesting shift. And I want to talk a little bit about that shift. And I think that that's interesting to look at, that international debt system, because it's precisely one of the key levers, if you will, through which these structural asymmetries in the global political economy continue to operate. And so usually, just to put some flesh on the bones of that sort of conceptual distinction, usually when we think of that territorial logic of imperial power, we tend to think of, for instance, the Spanish example. Spanish colonialism in the Americas was very sort of direct form of military coercion, the expansion, occupation of territory, the extraction of value through very direct and overt forms of military subjugation, right? But actually that's just one part of the story, because we already see that even in the Spanish case, there was an engine, if you will, behind the Spanish imperial project that was much more capitalist in nature than the Spanish state was at that point. And that, of course, was the city-state of Genoa, which was actually, throughout the long 16th century of Spanish imperial dominance, the main financier of the Habsburg monarchy. And it wouldn't have been possible for the Spanish to build up the enormous military power, the military and naval might that they built up over the course of the 16th century, and that they used in order to occupy and colonize the Americas, if it weren't for the complex system of international loans that was developed by Genoese financiers over that period. So Fernand Braudel obviously referred to the 16th century actually as the era of the Genoese, or the century of the Genoese. Because it was actually the Genoese who managed to profit from this Spanish colonization to a fantastic extent, because they made the loans and then got the interest payments back from the Spanish state. So this developed over the course of the 16th century into a situation where the Spanish monarchy, the Habsburg monarchy, grew increasingly dependent on these Genoese financiers to be able to continue its military expeditions abroad. And because its empire was so sprawled out and included areas as far apart as the Americas, the Netherlands, Sicily, Naples, they needed a fantastic amount of military power to keep that situation sort of relatively stable. And those loans were very important because without them, they wouldn't be able to essentially pay for all the military expenses, right? They had money coming in the form of silver from the American mines, but the amounts were not always sure how high they would be, and they came in at irregular times, whereas the armies had to be paid at regular intervals. So this system of loans became really central to the operation of the Spanish Empire, already at a very early stage. Essentially what happened then towards the end of the 16th century is that you can start seeing that this growing military expenditure increases the structural dependence of the Spanish monarchy on these Genoese lenders. And as a result, the Genoese lenders managed to basically gain power over the Spanish monarchy to an extent that caused one Spanish jurist to complain at the time that Spain had become the Indies of the Genoese. So the interesting dynamic there is happening where you have this colonial territorial logic of colonialism applied by the Spanish in the Americas and other territories in Europe, but at the same time you have the Genoese expanding their capitalist power over the Spanish state, over the Spanish monarchy at least. And there's one very particular case where that clearly comes to the fore, which is when King Philip II defaulted on a major loan to the Genoese. And whereas he had normally done that with impunity, and he could have done that, for instance, when he was borrowing from the German bankers, the Fugger and the Welser, he could do that without any consequence. When he did it on the Genoese actually managed to block all international credit to the Spanish king, and thereby forced him to come back to the table and renegotiate the defaulted debt, and at least pledge some of the silver revenues that were coming in from the Americas to the Genoese. So that was one way in which this capitalist logic of power was able to basically channel a lot of that value that was being extracted from the Americas directly into the financial sector in Genoa. Now, it was not just Genoa. I mean, like I said, there were German bankers involved in the city of Augsburg. There were bankers involved in the Netherlands, especially in Flanders and Antwerp. But eventually, over the course of the 16th century, Spanish power started to decline. And we see what happens is that eventually there's a shift in the center of economic gravity in Europe towards the northwest of Europe, particularly the Netherlands and the United Kingdom. And in the 17th and 18th century, we see Amsterdam becoming the main sort of financial hub. It's a similar model as the Genoese model in the sense that the approach of Amsterdam was not based on a large territory, but it was very much based on this capitalist logic of accumulation, right? We can think of the VOC, the Dutch East Indies Company, the first joint stock company, according to some, which played a very important role in the expansion of the Dutch Empire towards the east, and basically had a monopoly not only on trade with the east, but also on military force, on actually using naval power in that region. Now the Dutch used some of the surplus that they extracted from the global south to build up a fantastic financial empire of their own. And the Dutch soon became the main lenders to monarchs around Europe, providing them with international loans. But this was still sort of a phase in which European lenders were not really lending money to non-European powers. They were just lending that money. It was really an intra-European affair. So the Dutch were lending to the French monarch. They were lending to the Swedish monarch, to Russia. They were lending all over Europe, but not outside of Europe. And that really only began to change with sort of the revolutionary period, the period of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Because in that period, a number of shifts occurred. First of all, the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars caused a series of sovereign defaults throughout Europe that basically crippled Amsterdam as a leading financial center. And Napoleon, of course, occupied the Netherlands, which basically undid the financial supremacy of Amsterdam at that point. And the center of gravity at that point switches to London. And I'm going to talk about that in a second because that's a very important development. The second thing that happens, of course, is that Napoleon also occupies Spain, which really weakens Spain's position. And eventually, the whole revolutionary ferment of this period also includes the Latin American independence struggles. So what we see in the 1820s is that the Latin American countries gain independence, and they begin to borrow on international capital markets to try to get the money to wage their wars of independence against Spain. And because they don't have any financial sectors of their own, they're dependent on an external source of credit. And that external source of credit became the London Stock Exchange. And London at that point was in the sort of thralls of a major speculative boom of the 1820s that saw between 1822 and 1825 a massive amount of money being lent to these newly independent countries in Latin America. And within a couple of years, in 1825, that led to a massive international debt crisis. That was really the first major international debt crisis that involved countries outside of Europe. So it's kind of like the first time that we see this dynamic being established of international debt between the advanced capitalist core, if you will, and the peripheral countries. And that was a very important development for a number of reasons, because for Latin America, it basically meant that they, on the one hand, gained a lot of resources that allowed them to throw off the yoke of the territorial occupation of the Spanish. But at the same time, in the process, they indebted themselves to these London financiers and became integrated into an international financial system that then reproduced a certain core-periphery dynamic and reproduced a certain asymmetrical relationship that continues until this very day. And I think that is that capitalist logic of power of which I spoke before. And of course there are other elements in that too. Unequal exchange, extractivism, land grabs today play a very important role as well. But I'm looking specifically at the role of international debt in sort of cementing these asymmetries in the global political economy and allowing for these structural inequalities to exist beyond the national independence of these formerly colonized countries. So the Latin American experience of the 1820s is very interesting. But one thing that stands out for me is that throughout the 19th century, as Latin America borrows repeatedly from investors on the London Stock Exchange, they do have a certain autonomy, or at least a certain capacity, to throw off those debts the moment that they enter into crisis. So what we see in the 1820s, what we see again on a large scale in the Depression of the 1870s, is that these Latin American countries almost always suspend payments when they hit a time of crisis and when they can't repay their debts anymore. So that shows that there was at least a degree of economic autonomy on the part of these countries, that although they depended on these international capital markets to be able to attain credit and develop, they at the same time were able, when they reached a crisis, a moment of crisis, to deflect some of the costs of adjustment onto lenders abroad. And that basically continued happening straight up to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And in the 1930s, the vast majority of Latin American countries actually suspended payments. They imposed these unilateral debt moratoriums. And by some calculations, over 1 million US bondholders, up to 2 million potentially, were affected by this. So I think that's a very sort of interesting development if you look at that dynamic, because there's clearly an asymmetry in the relation of power, but nevertheless a degree of autonomy even on the part of these Latin American countries to simply stop paying and say, okay, let's move on. From here, and they only renegotiated those debts after their economies had recovered, which allowed them, according to some sort of econometric analyses, a much better chance at recovery than some of the countries have today. And that's finally where I sort of converge upon the contemporary period and how that contemporary period is different. Because after the 1930s, there's a long period in which there's no major international lending between the countries at the core and the countries of the periphery. But starting in the 1970s, international capital begins to flow across borders again with the breakdown of the so-called Bretton Woods regime. And what we see is that, again, there's a huge amount of lending taking place, especially from the New York money center banks on Wall Street to Latin America, but also to other developing countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and some of them in Eastern Europe, and some in Asia as well, in the Philippines. And what happens in this crisis is very different, because there's no sort of direct type of military coercion involved in trying to get those loans repaid. We had seen a lot of that, and maybe I can talk a little bit about that in the 19th century, especially in the age of classical imperialism between 1870 and 1914. There had been quite a lot of military intervention to try to get debts repaid, most famously in the case of Egypt, in the case of Venezuela, in the case of a number of Caribbean and Central American countries. There were direct invasions, occupations, gunboat diplomacy, this type of stuff. In the 1980s, we don't see this anymore. Yet we see a very stunning turn towards debtor compliance. There's a widespread insistence on debt repayment throughout the crisis of the 1980s that we had not seen in any of the previous major international debt crises. So what happens in the 1980s is that obviously the International Monetary Fund comes in and provides these bailout loans to these Latin American and other developing countries in order to keep them solvent. But in return for these loans, it makes these very strict demands. It imposes these conditions that involve a variety of market reforms and austerity measures geared towards freeing up revenue for external debt servicing. And that mechanism becomes so successful that throughout the 1980s, there are a number of debt reschedulings and there are a number of debt restructurings, but there are no major unilateral defaults like we'd seen in the 1930s. And so this is really, at least in my reading, a kind of turning point. 1982, the beginning of the Mexican and Latin American debt crisis, where this capitalist logic of power, this capitalist logic of empire, becomes so powerfully cemented that it can enforce full repayment and continued debt servicing with all the attendant social and economic consequences of that, without any dependence in an immediate sense on direct military intervention. Right? So I'm not saying that military intervention is no longer an important factor in the world today, absolutely not. But when it comes to debt repayment, it has receded to a certain extent. And there are now other ways, operating through financial markets, operating through international financial institutions, to force countries to repay. Maybe we could talk a little bit about specifically how these mechanisms work out. But obviously we see very similar dynamics repeated in the 1990s with a new set of debt crises emerging in the developing world. And in the sort of past decade, we've seen a lot of that happening in the European periphery, of course. Also now in Puerto Rico, very prominently, although it's a slightly different case because there is absolutely no sovereignty involved in that case. So this is what I'm kind of looking at, sort of this historical evolution of the international debt regime and the way in which creditors and creditor states can force heavily indebted countries to repay, even in the absence of using gunboats or sort of direct imperialist occupations. So obviously that comes out, I think, in the Greek case very prominently, and maybe we could talk a little bit about that later. But I think that that's fundamentally the shift that we find ourselves in today, is that there's been this shift in the logic of domination in which debt plays a very important role. It basically fulfills the role that was previously fulfilled by the gunboats themselves. Right? So financial markets create a certain dependence that forces heavily indebted countries to repay because they know that there's this risk that if they don't repay, they'll be locked out of international credit markets and they will suffer enormous social and economic consequences that will be particularly costly, of course, for the elites inside these countries. Okay?
Yeah.
So leave it there.
Thank you. Cool. I've rarely learned so much in half an hour. This is great, guys, and I think there's going to be so much to talk about. I have one sort of rambling, nonsensical question, which I'll ask to both of you, and then we can open it up to the floor. Before I ask that rambling, nonsensical question, I just want to give everyone a bit of a heads up about what's going to happen as we sort of transition from this session into the next session, which is breakout groups. So, of course, we want to have a good discussion about these topics and with our speakers in this session. And I'll ask you, when you ask your question or to make your comments, to please introduce yourself. Don't feel like you need to announce your academic rank or place in any hierarchy. You can simply introduce yourself in any way you wish. But please do introduce yourself, because part of the ambition of this gathering of these 2 days is to allow us to develop new collaborations and learn from one another. So it's helpful to know people's names as we move through. In that spirit, what we'll do at the end of this session, as we move into the breakout session, is I will ask if those of you in the audience and who are participants this weekend have particular topics you'd like to meet and speak about over the next, we're going to end this session at noon, and then there's a 45-minute section for breakout groups. And so I will ask if there are particular topics you'd like to speak about. For instance, I'm very interested in talking about the way that, as Paul mentioned at the beginning, his interest as well in many ways is in how notions of risk are imagined, and specifically how those notions of risk are racialized and haunted by empire. So I would love it if people were interested in that working group. You might also have an interest in proposing a breakout group. And so at the end of this session, I'm going to ask if people do have those. If not, I have a bunch of extremely embarrassing icebreaker games that we can play. You don't want that to happen. So think of a breakout group. Please do us all a favor. Okay, we'll come to that in about 45 minutes from now. I have so many things to ask both of you. But I wanted to make one link that's maybe tentative and perhaps very tentative from what you both said. Jerome, you spoke about this very important transition from the forms of sort of territorial imperialism to debt imperialism, and the way that this has sort of characterized really the history of our moment, arguably since before 1492, perhaps from 1488, which many people date to the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade, but certainly since 1492 and the invasion of the Americas and the European invasion of many other places in the world. And that transition occurring in fits and starts in a sort of, surely, but in kind of a variegated way, in different, as the sort of center of capitalist power moves from different place to different place. So this movement from a logic of, sort of direct plunder to debt bondage in a certain sense. And it reminded me in a certain parallel, like Jesu, of what you were speaking about this moment that you identified in the particular case study with the moment when the extractive economy collapses, the fur economy in colonial North America, quote unquote. Leave the scare quotes there for future reference, where you see this transition from maybe something that looked more like a kind of direct territorial domination to the configuration of these laws and protocols around property, which then become the bedrock, as you say, for the kind of later financialization and of property as the kind of core of the global financial system. And I was interested in what you mentioned there about how this is the moment when sort of race and racialization kind of emerges as a necessary part of the picture. Of course, there had been different ways in which Indigenous people had been racialized through European discourses before that, but there's this need to kind of frame the Indigenous other as not deserving of the same property rights as the European colonists. But then this other thing that was interesting that you mentioned, and again, sorry, this is kind of long and rambling, but it leads back to Jerome in a moment, that then these same techniques that are developed and pioneered, pun intended, to seize Indigenous lands, get then applied to settler subjects and to European subjects. And this kind of comes back to a discourse that we're amidst today where as more and more populations and countries that might have once thought themselves immune to the forms of debt bondage that were once reserved for the colonies and for colonized others, as those become applied to the center of empire and populations at the center of empire, there's a strange discourse of appropriating a language of colonization or claiming a language of being colonized. So, for instance, in the Greek debt crisis, there was this rhetoric about Greece being colonized by Germany, which has some level of accuracy, but also erases a lot, in terms of the actual horrors that were unleashed under colonialism in previous times. And similarly, the sort of racist fears that have been awakened in order to justify something like Brexit, or the neo sort of revanchist white supremacist culture that's on the rise in the United States, where there is a feeling of that there's a risk that these populations that once imagined themselves to be the beneficiaries of racial privilege are now being colonized somehow by debt or by international institutions. And so to sort of wrap it up, I'm curious about the way that race and racialization works in these transitionary moments in the history of colonialism and empire to allow the system in some ways as a sort of transitionary object, to borrow the Freudian language, something that allows for a certain transformation of the system at certain moments in certain times, but then also becomes this object of both fixation and fear. As I told you, it would be a long and rambling question, but I suppose I'm curious about if you think that depiction is perhaps accurate or what it also inevitably leaves out.
Yeah.
It's a lot. So
Yeah.
I have a lot of things to say, and I'll try to remember what they all are. So the process of racial differentiation, I think, takes place before the colonists even set sail for America. Because when they do that, they're really going with the notion that they have these land grants that they just have to fulfill, which is already a negation of the sovereignty of all the groups that are living there. The sovereignty of those groups and their rights to the lands simply doesn't matter. So there is this kind of, common understanding on the parts of the investors and the crown and the colonists who are actually setting sail that they're going to engage in racial violence in order to make good on the investments of private individuals and also sovereign in this project. Mostly this is privately funded, these enterprises, at least in North America. And so, of course, this racial distinction gets elaborated in all kinds of ways once people are in those territories, in ways that also enable other kinds of disregarding of various aspects of the communities that people are encountering, and other kinds of practices, specifically killing people, spreading disease, doing all of those kinds of things. But I think there is a general conception, even before that, they're going armed. They're not expecting no conflict. They know it's going to be a violent confrontation. So I would say that. And then you see that the elaborations that create a sociocultural world, this very riven, divided, racially divided and violent world that we still have. These are really the foundations of it, I think. You see all that getting elaborated as the project plays out, but I think it's there from the very beginning. So I wanted to say that. The way I think that land is important even in the early period, the period of the extractive economy, because in part of these land grants that really say these colonists have a right to try to take possession of these lands and all the goods in them. And I think you see, even before the creation of the land market proper, you see control of land, taking possession of territory is very, very important to changing the power balance within the colonies. And so narrowing the land base of the people who have been living in a place for centuries also narrows their ability to survive, because there's very there's about 20% arable land in New England at this time, and so this is the land that colonists are trying to take control of. I mean, they're bringing thousands of people in. So there's about 100,000 by the end of the 17th century that they have managed to induce in. And so I think the work that I do is really trying to push back on notions that the land market isn't really important until the 18th century and isn't a key factor. I think it is, and whether or not colonists are creating registries, the narrowing of people's range of mobility and ability to survive in relation to the places that they have inhabited forever is a significant land practice, even though notions of enclosure and the right to exclude and things like that are getting enacted on a collective rather than an individual level during the early period. So land is still really important. That's what I wanted to say about that. I forget some of the rest of your question, but I do want to put something on the table, which is sort of a response to Jerome and this provocation that there is replacement of gunboat diplomacy with these sort of coercive debt relations, because as a legal scholar, a lot of what I have thought about is the interplay between these two things, the use of direct force and indirect coercions, which you can see in the project on immigration as well. And what I find very striking in the literature throughout for 400 years is the commentary that direct forms of force are very expensive. It takes a lot of resources. The PR is terrible. Lots of people die. And so there is, from the very beginning, a sort of negotiation with these facts and a preference for using indirect strategies of coercion through financial practices like the ones I'm describing, indebting leaders of indigenous communities in order to then extract tribal lands and so on and so forth. And it's pretty explicit in the colonial conversation. It's better to do things not by force if we can, but in the last resort to bring in force. And I think about this a lot because obviously everything you're talking about is still happening in the shadow of enforcement powers. And yet also, so to extend these kinds of coercive relations is also, of course, to grow the market. The more debt you have, the larger the amount of value is circulating in that debt economy. And so what I am really interested in always is, there is this, there's a limit to enforcement, which is why governments and private actors are so often choosing these coercive methods rather than the direct ones. But it is true that there is no enforcement power in the world that could enforce against mass refusal, right? So if everyone decided not to pay these debts, they really wouldn't be able to do anything about it. The trick is to mobilize on that level. It's very hard to do that, right? But it's a fact on the ground, and it's something that actually government actors are thinking about all the time when they craft these kinds of regimes. They're thinking about what kind of enforcement they can actually have at the ready, and what kinds of enforcement they can expect to have to use. And so this is a calculation always that is happening, and as the debt economy grows, so do the challenges for governments in that respect. And so this is something I'm thinking about in many different ways, including in immigration, in the field of immigration, as I was talking about. But it strikes me that it's a legal problem, but it's also an organizing problem. And it's a fundamental challenge, actually, to the market at a very basic level. So I wonder if what we're seeing now isn't another kind of
a shifting moment, but one that has been going back and forth in dynamics for a very long time.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. If I may respond to that, I think that these two logics have always been intertwined in very important ways and have never stood alone. And even today, I would argue that ultimately what stands behind everything in terms of propping up the international financial system is U.S. military might. There is no way of thinking about the existing structure of the world in the absence of that. What I do find interesting is this question of enforcement that you bring up, because I think that's really the key term here. And we do find that there's a bit of a distinct logic going on there, depending on what kind of debt we look at. So if we look at personal debt, or if we look at municipal debt, or if we look at any form of debt that occurs underneath, let's say, the national level, the enforcement is obviously in the hands of the state. But when we look at the international level, when we look at enforcement there, we do find a slightly different dynamic, because we don't have a world government that's capable of directly enforcing contracts between private lenders and sovereign states. So historically, the way that enforcement had happened was that certain imperialist states took it upon themselves to enforce debt contracts between private investors and sovereign states. And originally, of course, the United Kingdom was that sort of dominant enforcer. But it had a kind of approach which was a little bit ambiguous, let's say. They called it the Palmerston Doctrine, which kind of underpinned their approach, which was the idea that the British government should be able to decide at its own convenience whether or not it wanted to come to the assistance of investors. And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. And it's precisely for the reasons that you mentioned, because enforcement, sending in gunboats or directly occupying a delinquent debtor, is expensive, and it does look bad. So there were certain cases in which the British government strategically decided to send in the gunboats and to actually extract repayment and get back investors' claims, and other cases in which it didn't. So a very prominent case in which it did was 1902, the Venezuelan crisis, when a number of European powers, actually also Italy, and if I'm not mistaken, either Germany or France, sent gunboats to Venezuela to basically get the claims back that European investors were making on the Venezuelan government following a period of revolutionary upheaval that had brought Cipriano Castro to power. And that, essentially, the Venezuelan crisis was a major development for the whole region, because it was in response to that Roosevelt declared his famous corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, in which he reserved the right for the U.S. to basically become the policeman in its own backyard. Right? So the idea there was that the U.S. government feared that European gunboats in the Western Hemisphere were a direct intervention into the U.S. sphere of influence, and that would disadvantage U.S. investors, because the Europeans would be more likely to treat their own investors with a certain preferential treatment in enforcing those contracts. So it's actually in response to that particular crisis that the U.S. becomes a major imperialist enforcer of debt contracts between private investors and regional debtor countries, especially in the Caribbean and Central America. So that role has historically, I think, been fulfilled to some extent by imperialist states, but purely what I'm arguing in reference to the last couple of decades is that as an enforcement mechanism, that kind of direct military force in international debt management has disappeared, or at least become less central to the logic of enforcement. And the logic of enforcement now operates much more directly through financial markets and through these international financial institutions that we didn't have in the pre-war period. And for some reason, that has proven to be remarkably successful, even more successful than the gunboats were, let's say, in the 19th century. Because if you look at the actual rate at which sovereign debt is being repaid today, it's significantly higher than it has been at any other historical period, even in the wake of the global financial crisis, which was the biggest financial crisis since the 1930s. So there's something to be explored there, like how does enforcement work at the international level in the absence of a world government, in the absence of an imperialist power that is willing to send in gunboats? And why is it so effective today compared to sort of previous historical periods? So that's kind of the question that I'm looking at. But I do think that's fundamentally different from the way that, for instance, personal debt operates, where there's very much sort of a very direct state coercion involved in that process. I mean, try not to pay your debts and see where you end up. It's very likely that in some countries that you actually end up in prison eventually. So we still have a form of debt prison, even in the contemporary system. You'll get bailiffs at your door demanding you to give up, at the penalty of certain criminal charges, to give up your assets. So there's a very direct form of state coercion involved in that type of debt. So I just want to make clear that I'm not making a universal argument about the disappearance of direct coercion in the debt regime as such.
So I'd like to open it up.
Bunch of questions.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Hi,
Please.
thanks so much for the talks. My name is Dorminda Bambra. I've got a couple of questions, one for each of you. I was wondering, Paso, I really enjoyed what you had to say, and I thought it was incredibly good, and I was just wondering what the place of the Crown, or rather the enforced withdrawal of the Crown, had in changing financial practices across what comes to be the United States. So there's a particular point at which the British Crown is involved in the way in which land title is taken and so on. So I was just wondering how does that change after its withdrawal? And with Jerome, a different sort of question, because I was wondering how your analysis might change if you took seriously the global colonial circuits of finance, because your analysis was dependent very much on the relationships between Europe and the Americas. But much of the money that's available for the London Stock Exchange, for example, comes from enforced taxation and the colonial drain, as Pacific and others have talked about, from India. And there's an argument that's made that much of what Britain is able to do in the world, to the extent that it's able to lend to others, comes from money that's taken from India.
Absolutely.
And yet India and Africa and Asia more broadly play no part in the analysis that you're presenting. So your analysis of debt is only a Euro-Atlantic relationship, and that misses out most of the world, and I think distorts the analysis. So what difference would be made if you took the colonial circuits of financial practices seriously in terms of thinking about the argument you want to make?
Can I suggest we take a couple more questions and comments and then come back to you guys? Yeah. And do you want you? Yeah. Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
Well, thank you. First, mine is online. First of all, thank you for two extremely interesting presentations. Really good historical depth, which I just wasn't aware of. My question is for Jerome, and that is about the transition from what you said about the period up to the 1930s, where there were open defaults, and then what happened in the 80s where there weren't. How do you see the transition to that in two respects? One is, I should say how I came into this question, was in the mid-80s I worked as a financial correspondent in Paris, reporting on the Paris Club, which renegotiates the debts lent by governments. And one thing which happened in the 80s was that it was not just that the people on the lending side, if you like, the creditors insisted on repayment, but it was part of the psyche of the borrowers. The states already by then, they thought, well, we better keep up with it. And hardly any country, I think there was only one, which actually tried to openly default, and it was destroyed. It was Peru.
Exactly.
So there's that. Where did that come from? But also, you referred to the institutions. I can see two things here potentially. I don't know what you think about it. In helping to change the climate. First of all, the IMF, which when I first studied economics before that, we learned this having been created as a way of stabilising the financial system, the currency exchange. But in fact now it's known as a debt collector, which obviously is another role. So that was part of the structure. But also the origin of the Paris Club, a very secretive organisation originally, to enforce rescheduling of debts from the 1950s on. Can you enlarge on that in any way? How this came about?
I'll try, yeah.
The influence of these factors.
Sure.
If they were relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm going to reflect on the question because thank you again for your brilliant presentations. My name is Martina Matil. I'm a junior. I'm studying at LCC. And so I've got an interest in what's happening in the UK at the moment in light of Brexit, but also twinned with that, the way in which national identity seems to be so dependent on whatever laws pass at the moment. So I'm thinking about the crisis that started with the Windrush people, second generation who were here, didn't fill in their paperwork properly, and this process of deportation, forced deportation. So I'm trying to understand, I suppose, from a very local level in terms of the Caribbean region, talk about Latin America. I'm thinking about the Caribbean region specifically, and how the experience of Caribbean people is playing out in a contemporary experience where people actually moved from the Caribbean to come and work here, and now they're being people being deported as illegals, despite the fact they're paying taxes in this country, they've invested in the country. So it makes you wonder, in terms of financial are the financial markets affecting notions around identity? And I think about financial markets on the level of just investing in the country in terms of taxes. What happens to that investment? And I suppose in some sort of fucking art, I'm thinking about the discussion that is waged, in a sort of Pan-African context around reparation and the state of that argument. In some communities, within the black communities, is dismissed as complete fantasy that's never going to be able to be redressed. Whereas you've got some Caribbean leaders who are actually trying to work out, negotiate some sort of model reparation. So I'm just, in my muddled way, just trying to get a sense of how the financial markets impact on very local experiences of national identity, with the focus on the Caribbean and the Caribbean experience in the UK.
John.
Yes, as everyone else, so thank you for these excellent presentations and how they work together. So I'm John Montgomery. My question is actually to both of you, just to see if, to kind of draw some connection here about this kind of moral economy of the contract that evolves over time, right? The kind of moral claims of contract as some superior kind of arbiter of right? So, the sanctity of you agreed, and therefore, must pay or must get off or, whatever, and how this is kind of used to kind of mediate the movement around compliance. So we move from how we enforce the contract at the end of a barrel of a gun, or do we move to kind of more kind of emotive forms and sort of sociological forms of enforcement? And I think there, not that I disagree at all with your kind of characterization of national debt enforcement versus personal debt enforcement, but you kind of see the way in which it still relies on very sort of nondescript forms of punishment, more like threats. Because who makes a run on a national government? Traitors? Where are they? Who are they? I mean, they're totally decentered. They're never named. They're just, how they coordinate, no one knows, but they make a run, right? The financial market makes a run. And then that forces you to comply. So do you see they still use the kind of the threat of sort of being out of the good graces of the high priests of, foreign exchange, right? Or something like that. Foreign investors will turn against you in a very sort of cultural way that will, again, enforce the contract in different ways. So I just wondered if, to kind of bring those two together and think more about, what is the moral economy, or I'm thinking of whose name I forget, on the kind of biopower of contract.
Lazzarato? Lazzarato?
Yeah, no,
Lazzarato?
it wasn't
Okay.
Oh, Angela Metropolis.
Ah, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all for these great questions. We'll have more time for them in a moment. Yes. Oh. Let's maybe come back to you guys.
Yeah, do you want to?
Sure. Start with the role of the Crown. One of the things that I'm interested in is the way the United States, once it's established, replicates a lot of practices that are developed under the Crown. So it's under the administration of the Crown that the system of preemption is developed, where nearly every single colony develops rules for who can buy land directly from tribes. And so this is in part what leads the colonists to revolt and declare independence, because they view it as this tyranny that they're not allowed to just land grab all over the place, and they need licenses. But of course, as soon as the United States is established, they set up a preemption system themselves that looks exactly like the one that they've just rejected, and that becomes the basis of the land policy of the United States. The whole land policy is based in preemption. So that's something I'm particularly interested in, but of course, more broadly, the use of land to finance the colonial project altogether, to obtain credit in particular, was also developed under the Crown and through its colonial administration. And so, I really think the continuities between the colonial period and its administration in the United States are very, very important, and acknowledged by legal scholars in particular, who almost never look at colonial government, and in particular at these questions of land use and migration. And so that's that question. To the question about, I think it's really right to pay attention to how financial markets impact identity and community relationships within a sphere. And I really think that so much is explained all around the world by this history of imperialism and the migrations that result from that, but also very direct histories of land dispossession and enslavement, because those are projects where the disposability of certain populations on the basis of racial justifications is very profitable. And so the economy emerges and these practices emerges as a society is being formed that is incredibly diverse, but also completely divided, and where life is valued very differentially. And so I think we're all living with the effects of that. These problems are often conceived of as being divorced, but of course they're not. And the disposability of bodies that's assigned in order to further these financial practices stays and affects every single dimension of people's lives, the affective dimensions of people's lives, the possibility of relationships of any sort, and so on and so forth. We all live them in a very embodied way all the time. And so that's something that I am trying to bring out in the piece that I'm writing now. Reparations, there should be reparations. One thing I really love is this turn in the conversation. In the US, I don't know how many of you are following the debate about modern monetary theory, but I love it. I think it's a great dialectical turn to think about how to use existing monetary systems, but against the grain of how they have been used previously, and the idea that you could have deficit spending to feed starved sectors of society is really appealing to me, and also that you could generate money in this way to pay reparations is absolutely right to me, and I'm so pleased to see it's gaining traction in the popular sphere. The moral economy of the contract, I think, is also something I think about a lot. I'm working at a law school right now, and so people really believe in the moral sanctity of the contract, and seems so distressed by things like arbitration contracts and all these things that give the lie to the idea that there's actually a mutual agreement and a meeting of the minds and all of these things. And of course, it's not surprising to me because I work on the history of colonization, which was mostly conducted through contractual transactions. And so I'm trying to extract myself from the logic of these conversations a little bit, because I talk to law professors a lot and always say the same thing, which is just like, can you imagine the above ground economy of contracts without the underbelly of the predatory types of transactions that have always existed? And in fact, not just that these two things have existed side by side, but that they are interdependent, because what is being traded in the above ground contracts is actually what is being extracted through the predatory forms of contracting that was actually the basis of the colonial project. So when people came over to America, they were engaged in a project of extraction that then allowed them to contract with one another, and in fact produced a lot of rules governing contracts that are the basis of at least U.S. law contracts now, to honor mutual agreements. There's Schmidt talks about this at the international level, right? The degree of peace and harmony that is achieved between Western nations is, I think, reflected in the kind of respect for contracts and mutual rights achieved in civil society between settlers, which is, of course, defensive, because if you have people who are fighting all the time, they can't effectively, wage war and conquer other peoples, which is what they're really there to do. So these things are completely imbricated in one another. The development of a contract law that protects people's rights and these above-ground contracts, which law professors make it their business to study, in fact, is predicated on unity that is necessary to continue this project in a context of extraction, which is what they're doing. And so I think, again, studying this history absolutely shows us this dynamic, which persists today in the origins of it, and allows us to ask real questions, whether one could exist without the other, which I clearly think they can.
So let me first respond to the great question about India's place in this narrative. I think it's a fascinating question and a very important one. And maybe I'll start by just explaining a little bit what the nature of my project is, because it allows you to get a perception of the angle from which I'm coming at the question, which then explains why I decided to focus my story mostly on Latin America. So first of all, the question technically that I was asking, I was speaking mostly about the research that went into my book that's just out now, is why countries repay their debts as opposed to defaulting on them. That's really my main sort of interest. And then the question becomes the question that you raised before of enforcement. So in the absence of an international world, sort of power or world government that can enforce these debt contracts, how are countries forced to repay? And so the reason that Latin America becomes very fascinating in that story is because it was the first set of formerly colonized countries that gained independence and that became sort of integrated into this international financial network as debtors. That doesn't mean that other parts of the world were not relevant to the bigger picture of how the international financial system came to be constituted. But that was not necessarily the question that I was initially looking at. We can look at that question, and I think it's a fascinating one, because actually if you look at India's role in all of this, it was absolutely seminal in allowing Britain's emancipation, if you will, from a debtor to a creditor country. Because it was actually the taxes that were extorted from India that allowed the British to repay their debts to the Dutch, and in the process accumulate enough capital to become a major lender in their own right. So there's absolutely fundamental importance there if you look at, let's say, the side that comes before the lending of India's role and of the broader role of British territorial power throughout the world. So that's absolutely central for understanding the rise of Britain as a financial power. It's absolutely central to understanding the emergence of the international system of loans. But it's less important for the particular specific question that I was asking, which is the question, why did the Latin American countries decide in the 1820s to default en masse, and in the 1870s and 1930s again, and in the 1980s decided to repay? So that's the only reason that I ended up focusing on this part of the story and not the other part. In response to the second question, which directly goes to the question of the 1980s, I think it's absolutely fascinating observation that it's absolutely true. It's not just the creditors who insisted on full repayment, it's the debtors themselves. And that, I think, is a fundamental difference that occurs at some point between the 1930s and the 1980s. And I interviewed some people, policymakers, who were quite central to this in the 1980s in Mexico, including the current head of the OECD, Ángel Gurría, who was the manager of the debt office in Mexico. And he, in the interviews, kept insisting that the most important thing for Mexico was to be a responsible debtor, and that it should continue servicing its debts. And he gave a couple of reasons for that. First is the argument that Mexico would have been locked out of international capital markets if it had defaulted, precisely at a time when the government was growing more and more dependent on international credit to be able to meet its own government expenses. So there's a growing credit dependence at the heart of all of this that wasn't really there as much in the 1930s. Governments were less dependent on credit per se to run their operations. They were more able to run their operations from tax revenue and any extractive income. A second thing that he argued is that international credit was absolutely crucial because it allowed the government to obtain the foreign exchange with which to buy the corn from the US, which was the staple good. And there's also sort of a very important dependence, because it was actually the corn imports that allowed Mexico to feed its population. US farmers had just Sorry?
Even in the 1980s?
Even in the 1980s. So large U.S. farmers had already pretty much destroyed the capacity of small farmers to provide the whole Mexican population, especially Mexico City, with sufficient food. So that was a very important consideration for the government. There was a fear that if they didn't obtain a foreign exchange, they wouldn't be able to import enough food to feed the population. So that speaks for itself, what would happen in that scenario. But there are other reasons as well, and I think that they're equally important. And that's the role of the actual financial sector inside Mexico itself. So Mexican bankers were also significantly exposed to their own government debt, either as lenders themselves or as intermediaries between the US banks and the Mexican government. They would have folded in the event of a Mexican default. And there was a realization in early '82 that, when the crisis broke, that this was the case. And the government briefly tried to actually nationalize the banks to break the power of the domestic financial sector to be able to move towards a more heterodox response under López Portillo, who was a slightly more left-leaning president. But eventually that completely failed, and they were forced back into line. But you're absolutely right. There was an insistence across Latin America on debt repayment, and that sort of discipline was internalized into the debtor states. And there's a term for this that I found quite useful, and that's credit rating self-preservation. So what a lot of Latin American borrowers did is that they actually tried to distinguish themselves actively from cases like Peru, which followed a more heterodox line, and said, look, we're not Peru. We are actually responsible debtors. We want to repay our debts. And the concern there is not just the moral one. I think the moral one is there. The ideological one is there too. But fundamentally, it's about access to credit. Because if you are seen to be an irresponsible debtor in line with Peru, you're going to pay much higher interest rates, and you're going to find it much more difficult to access any available credit, which is either way already receding because of the crisis. So I think that these are some of the dynamics that play into all of this, and the internalization of debtor discipline also, I think, plays an important role in my narrative of that crisis. And the domestic financial sector is a very important aspect in that, and I think that's also a major difference in the pre-war and post-war periods, is that the financial sectors in these debtor countries become more important intermediaries, and therefore they gain a certain power over their own governments, and the governments basically don't want to blow up their own financial sectors. That becomes another concern that they have in these debt crises. So there's an idea that even if you default only on your international creditors, your domestic financial sector still will be suffering because it can't obtain liquidity to be able to maintain itself in place. And then there was a third question about the moral economy, which I think is also, in a way, is very fascinating here. And there's, of course, this sort of central idea of the sanctity of contracts, and we see it very clearly in the context of the Greek crisis, where that sort of moral discourse becomes extremely powerful. So I'm Dutch, and whenever I went back to the Netherlands, when I was living in Athens to do my field work on the Greek crisis, and explained to Dutch people what I was doing, that I was trying to analyze why the Greek government was repaying its debts and not defaulting, I was met with scorn. It's like, is that a topic that you can study? I mean, if you borrow, you repay, right? That's just what you do. So there's this kind of like deeply embedded sort of creditor morality that sort of begins with a presumption that comes out very clearly in German and in Dutch, in the language, with the word Schuld or Schuld, which means both debt and guilt. So that the debtor is always already considered to be guilty or responsible for their own predicament. And therefore, morally, it should bear the burden of repaying in times of crisis as well. But nevertheless, I think it's interesting that while we take that completely for granted today, that wasn't always the case. So there was a time at which the sanctity of contracts was overruled by something that was considered more important in international law, and that was sovereign immunity. So if you look at the late 19th century, and again, the Peruvian case there is very interesting, because Peru in the crisis of the 1870s was the biggest Latin American debtor country. A lot of investment had gone there as part of sort of the guano boom, a form of fertilizer that was very prominently found on the beaches of Peru. And Peru was unable to repay all of its debts, and a number of UK investors took it to court. And in the UK, and basically tried to get a UK court to agree that the debt should be repaid. And what the UK court ruled was very interesting. It said that these so-called sovereign bonds are nothing but commitments of honor. They are not binding upon the sovereign nation insofar as the sovereign nation itself considers itself to be bound by them, because it is a sovereign state. So even in UK law, it was at that point impossible for the investors to reclaim their investment on the basis of the notion of the sanctity of contracts, because the concept of sovereign immunity was considered more foundational. Now, of course, the creditor countries took a lot of liberty with that, because they actually, at the same time, in the 1870s, began a process that eventually led to the invasion of Egypt over an unpaid debt. So it's not like they were very consistent in that, right? But I do think it's interesting to see how that notion of the sanctity of contracts was much more ambiguous in the 19th and early 20th centuries than it is today.
There's so much more to talk about, although we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to come to maybe just a final comment from both of you about the lessons for struggle, except to also echo John's sort of call out to Angela Metropolis' book, Contracting Contagion, which I think is a really interesting unpacking of this with a kind of analysis, too, of how the notion of the contract is very much tied to the constructions of gender and race and colonialism as well. So before we go to just shouting out ideas for breakout groups, which is our next session, I did want to come back to this topic of what the analysis you've both offered has to teach us about sort of struggles today. And I guess I would frame that in two ways, and you could choose to speak to both or neither. One of them is, are there particular struggles against this sort of network of forces that you find particularly inspirational that we should be learning from presently? And the second is more broad in general, which is that given that both of you have provided a sort of historical argument, what should we take from this history in terms of thinking through the politics of struggling against debts large and small today? Okay, so we'll begin with you.
I think I've already mentioned some things while talking here about sort of the terrain of struggle and steps forward. Probably the most important elements of that to me are, as this debt economy grows, which seems kind of unimaginable, it's already so large, sort of like television. We are what's getting sold. It's our means of subsistence that is getting sold. And so the market depends so much on people behaving as expected, increasingly so all the time, that actually so much power is being given over to the people through that move. And so I find a lot of inspiration in the kinds of organizing that subverts the logic of that and learns to use the system in more creative ways, including movements like Strike Debt, and also MMT, which I mentioned earlier, these ways of sort of reimagining how you could use these financial systems against themselves, since what they end up doing, as everybody knows, is to concentrate so much wealth in the hands of a very few. I think people don't often think about how much power we have, or all the different opportunities there are to intervene in that system. If debt is reduced to such little market value as it is, then buying up a whole lot of medical debt and forgiving it is a great thing to do, which is what groups like that are doing. At the same time, I was very invested in the struggle over land still, as I was talking about before, and so groups that are very much on the ground, the way that laws are arranged leaves groups who wish to defend their territories with very few options besides direct action. So much inspiration and respect for the groups that are on the ground struggling to defend their lands in places like Bears Ears and Chaco Canyon, all the pipelines led by indigenous groups. I have a lot of respect and draw a lot of inspiration from those.
Yeah, I came at this topic, which is kind of like a technical political economy topic, but I came at it originally because of the struggles, really. I was in Argentina in 2010 because I wanted to learn about the struggles that had emerged in the wake of the financial crisis of the preceding decade. And I was interested in Greece precisely because the struggles were emerging around this debt regime. And the sense that I got was that debt servicing, obviously, sovereign debt servicing requires a number of sacrifices, as they're often called, on the parts of the domestic population of the debtor countries in the form of austerity measures, privatizations, market reforms, pension cuts, wage cuts, you name it. And these often generate very powerful struggles from below. And we've seen that throughout the history of major international debt crises. And I've always been inspired by those type of struggles and wanting to learn from them, because they call into question at the same time multiple things. They call into question, on the one hand, the way that the world economy works, the financial system works. They call into question the role of international financial institutions and their unaccountable power over debtor countries. But they also, I think, call into power very fundamentally the logic of democratic representation, which is so thoroughly undermined by some of these mechanisms through which debt repayment is enforced. And so you find inside these movements very often very dynamic reconceptualizations of the notion of democracy, which I find particularly interesting and inspiring. So that's one thing that I've been looking at quite a lot as well, like in the Greek context, for instance, like alternative conceptions of democracy that emerged from within the anti-austerity movement. Same story in Spain. I mean, we can see the same story throughout Latin America in the 80s and 90s as well. So I think that that's very interesting and inspiring. But nevertheless, we can also, I think, see that so far all of that has been insufficient to kind of generate the type of shift in international power relations that we would need to see to be able to contain the power of finance and actually begin breaking it down. And I think in that respect, ultimately, the words of Thomas Sankara, the Burkinabé revolutionary, remain very pertinent. And he ultimately, argued in the 1980s debt crisis, speaking from a West African perspective, that ultimately the only way for the debtors to begin actually regaining a sense of autonomy and a sense of control over their own destinies would be to bond together. And precisely like Jesus said before, to leverage their collective power as debtors in order to extract better conditions from the creditors, or collectively default if they don't get such better conditions. And obviously, throughout history, that has proven to be a very difficult process to build that unified front. But I do think that that's ultimately what would need to happen, and perhaps even more than that, there would have to be some kind of unified front, not only between the debtors themselves, but also between the working classes in the debtor countries and the working classes in the creditor countries. And I do think that, what was interesting about the 2011 moment is that you have simultaneously these large mobilizations on the streets in the debtor countries, but also mobilizations in the heart of the financial empire, in New York, in Frankfurt, in London, in Paris. And while we cannot replicate that particular moment, I do think that that has fundamentally altered the way that politics works in all of these countries. So it's not just Greece and Spain where the centrist establishment parties have been called into question, but also the main creditor countries to a certain extent, at least in the UK and the US. So I do think that there are interesting shifts happening, and I'm very curious to see where it's going to lead in the next years and decades.